these boss mods require a deeper analysis sometimes that you don't get the full picture of right away. Oftentimes, the initial mod is good enough to start, but as you know, you get more variables, such as longer pulls or more pulls, or just different groups that have varying levels of skill. So, say for example, you compare a log from like Echo or Liquid to a log from like top 10,000 guild at the bottom who's hitting the berserk every pull. And you see different trends in the timers as a result of varying levels of DPS. You know, they push the boss at a different time. You know, a cheap example of this was the most famous Stone Legion generals. And it required a deep analysis to figure out what was going on, and I actually put the notes here in the mod, where I actually delved deep into the logs of not just one guild's pulls at the time I was working for Liquid. I was also looking into pulls of as many pugs as possible. I wanted to have a huge sample bias. I used tools like Warcraft Logs, which is why at the top of every mod, I actually have an expression like this, where I can copy and paste this into Warcraft Logs and instantly generate a report that looks something like this, where it breaks down all the boss's abilities for a very quick analysis. Every single boss mod I ever create has this table at the top for that reason. Because I always know I might have to return to a boss one day. Okay, this mod's from Cataclysm. Warcraft Logs didn't exist yet. So, there's an excuse for that one. But, if Warcraft Logs existed, this exists at the top of the mod. At least for raid mods. Dungeon mods, it's become a more recent trend because dungeon mods are getting more complex too, to the point where they're mini raid bosses at this point. But anyways, for this particular mod, the initial logs we had were simple. It's like Spinneret Strand, 1502 to 1524. Then 24 to 46. 46 to 68. 68 to 90. You look at this data, and it's obvious, right? The cooldown's 22 seconds. But look down here. 1612 to 1628. Suddenly, the cooldown was 16 seconds. That's when I have to go and look at the logs and go, what the fuck happened? Why is it 22 seconds, then 16, then back to 22, right after? What caused the 16? This is where deep analysis is required to figure out what's going on. Now, this log was magical. I found this log. Like, I basically opened like 20 different logs of the boss, but when I found this one, I was like, goldmine. Because this group was struggling. They wiped on the boss here. And they wiped on the boss again. And they wiped on the boss a third time. And their fourth pull, they were in phase 2 for 6.5 minutes. Think about that. 6.5 minutes in this phase. They probably had most of their DPS dead and decided to just fucking keep going and made sure it was a kill. But for me, this helps a lot. Again, I look at this pull. Every one of them is 22 seconds, except for this one. One cast in the entire pull of 6.5 minutes is 16 seconds, and I had to figure out why. And then I started looking at the other abilities. You know, this one stands out because it's, you know, purple. But let's look at Rolling Acid. Again, this ability was also 22 seconds. At first, you know, that was it. 22 seconds, right? Always 22 seconds. Then look here. Because this happened, this isn't 22 seconds. Now it was longer. And then looking at other pulls here. Oh, wait, sorry, that's phase 1. It's 20 seconds in phase 1. Well, kind of. Okay, this log doesn't have it, but like, there was another case where this was 16 seconds as well. So I did digging and I checked every spell, and every spell was doing it. Every spell was either 22 seconds, but in super rare cases was 16. So I had to do deep digging to figure out what was going on. And that's when you start looking at, well, obviously, the cooldown is not 22 because it can be 16, which means the cooldown is at least 16, possibly even lower, but is pushed back to 22 by spell queuing. Now, what is spell queuing? Well, that's a mechanic Blizzard puts into bosses to make sure that they're not overly punishing. Basically, let's say all 4 abilities come off cooldown at the same time. They don't want the boss to be chain casting, be like zap, 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 zap 4 abilities simultaneously. So what happens is anytime a boss casts an ability, they have an internal ICD coded into that boss to where he can't cast another ability for X seconds. Prevent chain casting. So what happens is when cooldowns have collision, well, it triggers something we call spell queuing, to where the second ability that came off cooldown can't be cast until the boss's ICD from the first spell he cast finished. So the spells get like queued up, in a manner of speaking, and cast after each ICD. So because bosses are getting more and more complicated, where they have more and more mechanics, spell queuing is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. In fact, Stone Legion Generals was one of the notorious pains in the ass for this. It had spell queuing so bad, the timer accuracy took a lot of effort to work into. You can ask someone like Liquid Max about this, and he'll tell you this boss was shit because of spell queuing. That like mechanically the boss was fine if it wasn't for all the spell queue issues, but the problem is pull A and pull B had different results, and pull C had different results. Because what happens with spell queuing is oftentimes, let's say 2 abilities come off cooldown at the same time. Well, in pull A, you might have cast Blades first, and pull B, you might have cast Blades second, and in pull C, you might have cast Blades third. And that's a real pain in the ass because each mechanic requires a different set of movements. So when you didn't know what was coming next, it made decision making more difficult. That's one of those things where Blizzard actually had to go back to this fight after the fact and adjust some cooldowns to reduce the spell queuing. They didn't fully solve it, but they at least solved some of the more severe cases of it that occurred during the fight. Now you see notes like this in the mod. That's when I figured out what the ICDs were. Now that's another thing about the ICD. The ICD isn't the same for every spell. So let's go back to this boss. I had to go to each spell and review them. Like I look at this one, Spinneret Webs, the one that was 16 seconds. It's like, okay, this was 16 seconds. So my answer to this wasn't to figure out why this was 16 seconds. At this point, I knew the cooldown is 16 seconds. My quest was to figure out why all of these aren't 16 seconds. Like, you might think it's the reverse. You might think the answer is to figure out why this one is 16 seconds. No. When you're figuring out spell queuing, the answer is always to first find the lowest variable, the lowest timer, and then apply that as the timer for all of them, and then figure out why the rest weren't that. So, okay, no, the cooldown is not 22 seconds, it's 16 seconds. So I look here, and here, and here. Why are these all 22? So I look at the elusive spray. I forbid cast between each of these. And the expel webs that was cast here. This also had an elusive spray. So what happened that was different? Well, there's a missing rolling acid here. Rolling acid got delayed and pushed till after and changed things up. See how all of these is expel, erosive, rolling. Up until this point, that's what it is. Expel, erosive, rolling. Because I realized these were coming off cooldown at the same time, And just 19 times out of 30, rolling was cast first, but then suddenly Strands was cast first and rolling was cast second, and then the rest of the fight, not the rest of the fight, it actually sort of works its way out. It started casting after until this point when these two swap. And then this spell was 16 seconds. That's when I realized all the abilities have a 16-second cooldown, and it's causing them to have collision constantly. And at a point in the fight, two spells swap positions and cause one to be late and one to be early. So I had to code all of these as a 16-second timer and figure out the ICDs. So looking at it again, rolling acid. Every rolling acid, no new spell is cast for 6 seconds. If you look at the times, 33, 39, 59, 65, 81, 87, 03, 0.9, 0.10. It's still 6 seconds. It's 6.1, round 6 seconds rounding. And you do this for every ability. Every time this spell is cast, there's no new spell cast for 5.4 seconds. 5.4. This one's actually 5.36, so rounding it actually should be 5.3, but this one's 5.3. Yeah, it's 5.3 ICD. 5.3. So you get the idea, all this. So then I start noting it all down. I write it down. Less Stone Age in generals, but it's the same concept. You figure out what each spell and its ICD is before a new spell can be cast to determine what's going on with the timers. So let's look at Roshan, because that's the one I have a log for. Yep, Spinneret Strands causes a 5.3 ICD. Expel Webs triggers a 4-second ICD. Rolling Acid triggers a 6-second ICD. Explosive Spray triggers a 6.6 ICD. Actually, the funny thing was, it triggers a 6.66 ICD. I just rounded it down to... I always round it down to the 10th decimal place, because I don't want to deal with the timers that are uglier than that. And then what does this code do? I pretty much named it the same across the board for as long as I've been doing it. The first time I created this function was actually Archimond. Where is it? There it is. Archimond was a pain in the ass too because it had many rules. Now here's another funny thing about these. ICDs aren't always uniform. This fight had extra things to do. Like, Allure and Desecrate do not trigger an ICD for each other, but trigger them for everything else. So, for example, when Allure is cast, it'll prevent any other spell from casting for X seconds, except for Desecrate, and vice versa. So you have to look for that too, because sometimes just knowing the ICD even is not enough. Because sometimes the ICD has exclusions for other spells. There's one of those in Stone Age in Generals too. Let me look again. Let's see here. Heartrend had special rules that only apply in LFR. This really gets intricate. Like, you literally have to apply different rules to different spells and different difficulties for different spells. Like, it gets crazy. This fight, to get accurate, took so many iterations. Like, every time I thought it was perfect, I'd see another variable that was, like, not adding up. Like, sometimes the timer was still off, and I was like, why? And I'd keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. This is why I tell people, day one updates are like 80% there. When this raid comes out in live, like, even I'm putting out, and this is a dungeon, not a raid, but this dungeon might launch differently than it is now. Blizzard might actually see this and realize they want to fix it. They might decide, if we tweak a couple timers, we can reduce spell queuing, because oftentimes Blizzard doesn't like spell queuing, or it's kind of an oversight. Like, like I said, spell queuing exists for a reason. They don't want bosses rapid firing abilities. But sometimes when they test internally, like this boss, it doesn't start to break until you're in phase 2 for a long time. They might not have internally tested a 6.5 minute phase 2 poll. So internally, when they were testing it, they might have just seen 22, 22, 22, 22, and then the boss died. That's why initially the boss mod, when I released it, at 22-second timers, because that's all I saw until people started doing Mythic Plus on 10s and above. That's the reason when I'm doing log analysis, I look for the highest key possible, because the longer the poll, the better. Not only do I look for long keys, I look for bad polls. Bad polls are a goldmine for a boss modder. Like when I'm looking at up raid logs, I'm looking for polls that hit the berserk. I want to see your DPS is so bad you hit the berserk, because that's when I get the most data from the timers and can improve the boss mods with the most accuracy. So what does this function do now? Every time an ability is cast, so like on this boss, you just cast Rolling Acid. I fire the update all timers function with a value of 6, which means now it's going to iterate over all 4 of the boss's timers, and if any of these timers are less than 6, it will automatically update the timer to be a minimum of 6. This is what I was doing in Stone Legion Generals, and I remember Max actually complimented that was probably one of the best things that I did for them, is because it helped them understand what was going on in the fight in a visual representation through the timers. You know, you'd see the timers updating in real time as the mod is figuring out what's going on with the spell queuing, and it helped inform his decisions on that fight better. And that's done with deep analysis of mechanics, like this. And this has been going on as long as Xana's. Cataclysm, I opened this mod for a reason. This boss wasn't so much a spell queuing, but this is another example of a special rule. This boss has a mechanic to avoid the unmaking. The cooldown doesn't reset on phase change. It rolls over. But if there's less than 15 seconds on the timer when it rolls over, it's extended to be 15 seconds. Which is why this code is here to exist. It checks what's remaining on the time on phase change, and if it results in being less than 15 seconds when phase change ends, that's why it's like 45 and 54 here. It's counting for the duration of the phase change, but really it's correcting the timer for 15 seconds. Anyways, the point is, there's always rules like this that happen that are hard-coded in the fights that go into these, where Blizzard tests the fight internally and goes, Void the Unmaking coming out immediately on phase end is punishing. You want to have what I call a no cooldown window, to where in that window that ability can't be cast, period. For 15 seconds after phase change end, this ability cannot be cast. So it has a component of 2 things. It has a rollover timer, for if the time remaining is greater than 15, it will be cast on its natural cooldown thing. Like, I remember initially boss mods, because it was happening a lot with certain logs, they thought the timer would actually reset on phase change, and instead they started a 15-second timer here, but then they were realizing some polls, it wasn't being cast at 15, it was being cast at 21, 22, 23, and it took diving into the logs for multiple polls, multiple different guilds, and various DPSs to determine what was really happening, and know that it was a rollover timer with a no cast window. Which is why I always tell people, just because the raid's been out 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or sometimes 3 months, and you're still getting boss mod updates for the raid, and they're like, why? The raid's been out 3 months. Well, now we have 3 months of data and we got new information on how things work. Sometimes it actually takes that long to understand the intricacies of a boss fight. You know, Blizzard doesn't send us emails telling us, this is how the boss works. You have to figure that out. Honestly, 90% of the work that goes into boss mods is analyst work. I spend more time here than I do coding the mod. Like this mod, the coding for it is done. I can almost guarantee I'm still going to be updating this mod 3 months from now. You know, I'm still updating it now because since it's in beta, they're actually making active changes to the fight every time they put Mythic Plus testing up. You know, they take the fights down after they test them for a weekend, and they put them back up 2 weeks later, and they've changed a few timers. And when you change timers, this is affected as well. So first you got to figure out the new timers. Then you got to figure out the interactions of the timers with other abilities, and so on and so forth. You know, that's one of the things where I kind of miss the old days when bosses only had 2 mechanics, and this wasn't much of a problem. It was actually simpler times. Although back then, Blizzard created a different problem. See, modern bosses tend to use precise timers that just end up not being precise because spell queuing screws it up. In fact, let me tell you a story, and some of you might remember this. Artificer Zymax, not the first time he was fought, but the second time, he had a cooldown that was 30 seconds for one of his abilities. But what actually happened is due to spell queuing, the ability was cast every 60 seconds instead. It was never ever once cast at 30 seconds. Not once. Blizzard internally found this after the fact and considered it a bug, and they fixed it after it had already been live, and the ability was crewing every 60 seconds. So suddenly with the reset, suddenly the bosses cast this ability every 30 seconds. Everyone was going, what the fuck, Blizzard? You buffed this boss. And Blizzard replied, and it's like, actually, that ability was always supposed to be 30 seconds, but it was bugged. And he was skipping every other cast because of cooldown collision. And not every ability supports spell queuing. Some abilities don't get queued. This particular ability was one. So when it came off cooldown at the same time as another ability, he didn't queue the cast and then cast it after 6 seconds or 5 seconds like some of these spell queues work. He skipped the cast entirely. So every other cast was skipped. Anyways, they fixed the bug and it was 30. And they fixed the bug by adjusting the collision. Like, all they did was they changed the other timer by like 10 seconds or something. I forget what they did, but they changed the timer to fix the collision so it wasn't skipping casts anymore. Now, after feedback, they actually went back and changed the real cooldown to 60 seconds. They're like, well, fuck it. It was 60 due to the bug, we'll just make it 60 in reality. So in other words, the bug was still fixed, but they just made the timer 60. This actually still happens often, but the TLDR of it is, this is behind the scenes of boss modding, and analyst work is fun. This is the part of the job I actually enjoy the most. I really enjoy figuring out how things work more than anything else. Like, when I figured out how this worked, it's a satisfying moment when you go eureka and go, yes, that's the variable I was missing. That's the component I needed to perfect the mod. Like, I'm never satisfied when the mod is just good enough. Like, another example, Lich King in ICC. There's a very particular case where Defile and Valks have a cooldown collision. And when they have that collision, either one can come first. Either one. And it's a very specific cast in the fight. It's like the third overlap, I think. It could be wrong, it could be the fourth, but like it's a very specific overlap where you have to be on your toes and get ready to move for Defile if Defile comes first. Because usually Valks, it's like Valks, Defile, Valks, Defile. Then this one collision, it's Valks, Defile, but sometimes it's Defiled Valks. And if you're not on your toes, you wipe to Defile. Because you're expecting one, not the other. And it's literally like 1 out of 9 pulls. This is not something that like flip-flops pull to pull. It was like one of those things where you can have 8 pulls in a row where it's Valks Defile, and on pull 9, it's Defile Valks. This is why people hate spell queuing. Another boss that has a spell queue, was a spell queue nightmare, is Fall Avatar. Again, it was one of those things to where one difference caused a wipe because people expected X and they got Y. When they usually get X, 9 times out of 10, and they get Y one pull, but they react to X instead, and they're like, wait, no, fuck, wipe. And it's one of those things where it's like, as much as I love, like, I just said I love figuring this out, but at the same time, I also hate it from a support standpoint. Do you know how many times people come into Discord and go, your timers are wrong, fix them. We wiped because X happened and it told us Y was going to happen. And it's one of those things where I have to explain to people what spell queuing is, or spell locking in some cases, to where it doesn't queue the spell, it just skips it, etc. And how they just have to be prepared for, sometimes I can't fix it like this. Like, this can correct, this still won't tell you which one's going to be cast when they collide. Like, these 16s, when they happen, or the ones that increase from 22 to 24, because they, like, swapped with another ability, I can't tell you when that swap's going to happen. I can only correct the timers when it happens. Which is why what happens is, like, this mod's going to start 16-second timers, and it's going to be jarring at first if you don't understand what's happening, and then when the ability is like it might be like 3, 2, 1, 8, 7, and people actually wonder why this is happening. It happened a lot in Darkheart Thicket. That dungeon had massive spell queuing. Massive spell queuing issues. And I had code like this in pretty much every boss. And it took users a while to understand what was happening, but once they understand it, they actually realize that the way I'm doing it is probably better than, like, doing nothing at all, or coding in averages. You know, they want to know when things are going to happen, as precise as possible. But sometimes precise as possible isn't known until the time another spell is cast, when 2 spells are coming off cooldown at the same time, and you have to up the timers on the fly when spell X is cast instead of spell Y. Anyways, that's the gist of it. Sorry for the ramble. This video is probably going to suck on the YouTube metrics and have low viewer retention, but like the 1% of you that actually watch it through, I thank you. And I'll see you in the next one.